Please. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Before we get started, because this is virtual, if you could please mute your mic. We do have the opportunity at the end to ask Al questions, either through the chat room or by putting up your hand feature. This session is being recorded, and we can send that link out once we have switch it from Zoom to YouTube. We also have the rest of the sessions, so session 1 to 9 on YouTube link if anybody would like that. Plus, we have all the presentation information. If you haven't been a part of the last 9 sessions and would like that, just send me an email. We'll make sure you have the PowerPoints and the documentation. So today we have Al Condeluci here, and I have the privilege to introduce him, and he's going to be talking about measuring loneliness. But before I introduce Al, I would like to introduce our guests. I'm honored to welcome everyone. This has been very exciting. I have a long list of participants that I wanted to share. So on behalf of Community Living Algoma, I would like to welcome our staff as well as, and if I forget an organization, I apologize, but put it in the chat if I miss, okay? So I would like to welcome Community Living Fort Francis, North Hastings Community Integration Association, Community Living Sarnia, Community Living St. Mary's, Live Work Play, Community Living Greater Sudbury, Community Living Guelph Wellington, Community Living Essex. And I apologize, I'm not sure what BDAI is. So if you could please put that in the chat, that would be wonderful. Community Living Chatham, Kent, Community Living Huntsville, Community Living Windsor, Community Living Grimsby, Lincoln, Community Living Oakville, Community Living Atikokan, Community Living Ottawa Upper Valley, Community Living Brant, Community Living Kingston, Empower and Simcoe, Community Living Welland Pellon, Community Living Access, Community Living Perry Sound, Community Living Dryden Sioux Lookout, and Haldmaid Norfolk Reach. So welcome. And I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Al Condeluci. We're very excited to be continuing working with him and having him here today. Dr. Al Condeluci has been a leader in community building, human services, and inclusive advocacy work for the past 50 years. Holding a Ph.D. and MSW from the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Condeluci has been the CEO of CLASS, Community Living and Support Services, a major nonprofit community building organization in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania from 1973 to 2019. He holds faculty status at the University of Pittsburgh in the schools of social work and health, rehab sciences, and is author of 7 books, including the acclaimed Interdependence, The Route to Community 1995, and more recently, Social Capital, The Key to Macro Change 2014. In 2018, he received the Key to the City of Pittsburgh, the highest civilian honor that can be given to a community member. He serves as a consultant advisor and human service coach and is on a number of nonprofit boards and government commissions on state, local, and national levels. He helped found and convenes the Interdependence Network, an international coalition of professionals, family members, and consumers interested in community engagement and macro change. And his contact information will be at the end of his presentation. So welcome and thank you, Al.
Tanya, thanks so much for the kind invitation, and thanks to all of you for plugging in. This is session 10 in the series that we've put together through Community Living Algoma. I want to salute the leadership and the staff and all the folks being supported in Algoma for their forward-thinking work in community building, and we've covered a lot of topics over these last 9 sessions, and as Tanya said, they're all available in the library, the YouTube library that Community Living Algoma has set up. So if you'd like to go back, or if you'd like to check any of those out, feel free to do that. Our session today is really drilling down on this notion of loneliness, and I know that earlier in our series, I guess maybe even our first or second session, we talked about loneliness and we talked about social isolation as issues, and we reviewed some of the information on those topics. And today we're actually going to dig a little deeper, because this notion of loneliness, over and above most of the organizations that are that are plugged into this session today, who support people with disabilities and families, that loneliness has really become a generic issue around the world. And we're discovering, and I think the pandemic had really been a face slapper about how potent and how debilitating loneliness can be. And one of the things we'll do today is we're going to examine some of the approaches to measuring loneliness, but more, we're going to do that in order to uncover some clues and maybe some directions that we can take as organizations and as individuals to really begin to to really get to the nub of what many people experience. Certainly, people with disabilities are a target group that loneliness affects in a more powerful way. So what we'll do, much like we've done in our previous sessions, is I'm going to go over some content. Tanya had sent you some of the material in advance, and hopefully some of you had the opportunity to do the UCLA Loneliness Scale. We'll focus in on that scale because that scale has really been the one that is now being utilized more often around the world, and it's been found to be reliable and valid, which is in any research, and especially social science research. Getting reliability and validity in a measurement instrument is really important. And so we'll focus in on that. We'll talk a little bit. Hopefully you took the scale, had a chance to measure yourself. But we'll also compare the UCLA scale with a couple other more widely used loneliness scales. So let's dig right into this topic. Loneliness, as I said, even pre-pandemic, had been identified as a negative determinant for health. And health insurance agencies, private insurance agencies in the United States, public efforts in countries that have, public medical intervention, have all been clear in identifying loneliness as a lethal phenomenon. And the thing about loneliness, and we'll examine definitions and things like that in just a minute, but it can be pervasive. You can be in a crowd of hundreds of people and be surrounded by people and still struggle with loneliness. Loneliness has also been stigmatized, so that when people don't want to talk about their loneliness or don't want to admit that they're lonely because of the negative stigma associated. I was just telling Tanya and Keenan before we got started that I'm doing this session from Las Vegas, where my wife and I and friends of ours came to Las Vegas yesterday, and we're going to be here for a couple of days. And here we are in the midst of hundreds of people, but the loneliness factor abounds. People laying in the corners, sleeping on the stairs. I was saying, so loneliness is really an epidemic generally in society. But when you take at-risk groups of people who might be at greater risk of loneliness, it's even more pervasive. And we'll look at some of the literature on this as we move through, because loneliness is a universal emotion. It's complex, and it's unique. How I might engage in terms of feeling lonely may be very different from how you feel. It has no single cause, and that this is the other vexing issue. Um, so we know that it causes people to feel empty and feel unwanted, which are so lethal and so prominent in terms of people feeling devalued or actually being treated in devaluing ways. Because we know that all people want to be connected. They want to be productive. That the human plight has really been one of wanting to be embraced, engaged, wanting to be connected, to be a part of community. All people want that, and so when you have this specter of loneliness invading, life, it can really be debilitating. And I think today, although most of us on this call are should be interested in loneliness as it relates to the work we do with men, women, and children who are experiencing disability, I think that we need to be aware that this is such a broader issue. I'm going to talk in a minute about efforts in the United Kingdom where they've really, and it's not disability efforts in the United Kingdom. These are generic efforts to address and combat loneliness. So when people are lonely or isolated, these kinds of outcomes unfold. That people have more sick days, there are greater bouts with depression, people feel alienated, and literally people die sooner who find themselves in lonely situations. And I'll show you some of the data on that in just a minute. But we know there are groups of people who are at greater risk of loneliness. All of us are at risk of loneliness, but there's groups of people by their situation that have been found to be at greater risk. The AARP, the American Association of Retired People, which is the largest advocacy, aging advocacy group in the world, has made loneliness and combating loneliness their number one issue. And both from a policy perspective, as well as from a social perspective. We know that folks who are economically disadvantaged are at risk of being lonely. Certainly, every one of us on this call, most of us are associated with organizations that support folks who are experiencing disabilities, should know that folks with disabilities are in a high risk group. Single families, certainly single parents, have really identified loneliness as one of the greatest challenges that they face. Mental health issues, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ populations, anyone who feels different are at risk of loneliness. Now, we know that loneliness is more difficult to put your finger on. Social isolation is quantifiable. I mean, we can identify, you could sit down with somebody you serve and you can, interview them and ask them questions about, people they know and places they go, and you can discover their network, their social network. And when somebody is socially isolated, they have less access to people. They lack minimal contact with people. On the other hand, loneliness can happen in the presence or the absence of isolation. You can be in the midst of thousands of people and still feel lonely. And it's subjective, it's interpreted by the individual. And so now one of the things that's really interesting when you begin to drill down and look at the literature on loneliness, that oftentimes people will measure their feelings about connectedness vis-a-vis other people they know and other people they see, right? And sometimes we'll say, well, gee, Keenan Weller, he knows everybody, he's so connected, he's got, and I don't really know that many people. And so, in comparison to another person, you might even exacerbate your feelings of loneliness when you begin to compare and contrast yourself with other people. We see this happening with teens, right? This is the big challenge that we're finding with social media and Instagram and some of these other platforms, where teenagers begin to compare themselves with other teenagers. That I'm not as handsome, I'm not as athletically agile, I'm not as this or as that from the other person. So that comparison piece is another thing that happens with loneliness, where you begin to say, well, you see other people around you and they seem like they're having a great time and they're connected and they're really, and you don't feel that same way. So literally the comparison can further heighten the feelings and the emotions that surround loneliness. Social isolation, as we said just a minute ago, is objective. It can be measured, it can be mapped, it can be identified. And often, we look to do that through social measures. So through identifying networks that are surround people. I think I've talked before in our sessions about, mapping an individual's connectedness through the platforms in which they connect with people. So through their family, through their neighborhood, through where they work, through where they spend time, where they worship, you can begin to get a sense, a quantifiable sense of someone's connectedness. But just being connected doesn't mean that somebody is not lonely, right? Somebody can seemingly be connected and yet really feel like they're isolated or alone. Sometimes we'll hear of situations where especially celebrities, where someone like Anthony Bourdain or Robin Williams take their own lives, right? And which is obviously that screaming about loneliness when someone goes that far. And we say Anthony Bourdain, my God, he goes all over the world, he eats this stuff, he sees people, how could somebody like that be lonely, right? And yet loneliness is measured internally. That makes it so elusive and so challenging. It is really this almost like this image that we have on the screen, like the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg versus the depth that someone might be struggling with loneliness, and then not want to tell you, or not want to talk about it, or not want to share their loneliness. Jean Vanier said that to be lonely is to feel unwanted and unloved, and therefore unlovable. Loneliness is a taste of death. I mean, this quote is chilling because in a way it is, this powerful sort of disconnector for people. So let's look just a little bit before we get into measuring loneliness and thinking about, well, how do we get our hands around this? How can we begin to to understand it more through measurement. But just looking at some of the data, this is a study that was done in 2010 out of Brigham Young University in Utah in the United States. And it followed, a large sample of people, 308,000 people. That's a huge sample. And it followed them for at least 7.5 years, in some cases following people 15 years. And what they discovered is that folks with social relationships reported less loneliness, right? And having a 50% greater likelihood of survival. This was stunning evidence just 11 years ago, unraveled. So the measuring and the looking at loneliness is such a new phenomena for us, especially those of us that are interested in social science and interested in the kinds of things that affect community in a general sense. But this study actually made loneliness more lethal than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day in terms of survivability. But there's also costs, right, associated with dealing with loneliness and social isolation. That in the United States, a study just done last year from Harvard and Stanford discovered that in the United States, there was a financial impact of loneliness upwards to $7 billion a year. That's with a B. And similar findings in other publicly funded sources in the UK and in Scandinavia. Canada has also begun to measure the financial impact of loneliness and separation from people. And Julianne Holt-Lunstad, who was the chief researcher, investigator in the Brigham Young studies back in 2010, says that simply living alone or in an isolated place may be just as harmful to your health as feeling lonely. And what they're zoning in on, and this study, by the way, done at Brigham Young University was funded by the AARP. And so it was really looking at elders and loneliness and the fact that many elders end up living alone when their partner or their spouse either passes on or becomes infirmed or institutionalized in a long-term care facility. So these two things, this isolation and loneliness, are equally debilitating. And there, now studies have begun to examine that there's a physiological response to loneliness that actually was a survival mechanism for us when, going all the way back to, when humans began to, roam the earth, and hunters and gatherers would be out there. If they got separated from their tribe, that they, literally got on edge. And I think I've talked about this in one of our earlier sessions, that the same thing is true for any of us on this call, that if you find yourself in a isolated situation that seems vulnerable, you're by yourself, you're on your own, I've used the example, you're at a conference or at a gathering, and you go out to get something to eat, you're walking back to your hotel and you're by yourself, and it's dark and you're in a place you don't know all that well. All of the physiological senses of respiration, circulation, your nervous system, the inflammatory system, all become more acute. And they become more acute. You become much more sensitive to sounds and the noises. But they do, our systems trigger those responses primarily to make sure that we're okay, that we get back safely, right? Um, and so on the short term, these kinds of things are helpful, but on a long term, they're essentially debilitating. If you're if these things kick in all the time because you feel lonely and you feel, even when you're not in a vulnerable situation, they have effects that can impact your functioning. um, Depression and loneliness are now so closely aligned that literally the increase to not just mortality but cardiovascular disease and strokes and heart attacks and um, arrhythmia, all of these things have had some are now being tied into this notion of loneliness. So, and even now, and this is probably the scariest slide that I have up in this presentation, because what we're really now, as we spend a little more time trying to measure loneliness, we're discovering that the youngest generation of adults are the ones that report being the loneliest. This study by Jamie Ballard in 2019, this was pre-pandemic, right? Before we had the lockdown, found that 25% of adults in that, and this was a study that really looked at, folks of all generations, all ages, reported having no close friends, right? And then 22% having no friends at all, no connections. So half the young people in the survey were basically reporting their loneliness, or at least sharing that they're lonely. In the United States, that the percentage of folks doubled since 1980, right? And these are kind of frightening statistics when you go 30,000 feet above society, community, culture, and you begin to look at these kinds of trends. They're frightening, because when somebody is lonely or isolated, there's disrupted sleep patterns, the immune system is altered, increased heart disease, as we said earlier, 30% higher risk of dying in 7 years. So the studies, and again, these are all very recent. We haven't, as a society, haven't really pulled the covers up on loneliness to look a little bit deeper. In 2018, Cigna Insurance Company, a private insurance company in the United States, because of the social determinants of health, identifying loneliness as one of the key factors of people having health disparity, wanted to really look more closely. They looked at 20,000 Americans. They used the UCLA scale. Now we're going to get into the measuring now. And they discovered some really powerful trends. 2018, this is pre-pandemic. And you could see some of the bullets on this slide, where folks, reported that they don't have, relationships that they can count on, that they don't have people that they could go to when the chips are done. So these were some of the findings, and in some of the debriefing that's been done recently on measuring loneliness, there has been identified some factors that seem to be associated with disability that have engendered more loneliness in folks with disabilities and families. Again, we talked about folks who are poor are at greater risk of loneliness, and we know that families who support their children who have disabilities have greater economic challenges, right? Because disability is costly. The things that government doesn't support or doesn't fund, families have to buy that privately. And when that happens, they have to dig into their economic resources. And so we know that poverty and disability are correlated phenomena. But the other thing that that really adds to families deciding to not engage are logistics. Any of us on this call who have been out with somebody with a significant disability, maybe out to dinner or out to some social event, know how challenging that is, right? That how difficult it is. You got to arrange transportation. You got to have parking that's available. You got to make sure the place is accessible. You got to be able to, if there are dietary issues that might be associated with the disability, you got to, all these things add more challenge to engagement, and consequently cause people to just bail on, say, well, what the hell, let's just stay home and make popcorn and, watch Netflix, because it's easier than navigating through, the logistical challenges that are out there. Increased medical appointments, that folks with disabilities are medicalized big time. And this, that then, doctor's appointments, clinic appointments, therapy appointments, all of these things mount up and they take time away from engagement. And social stigmas, where someone, basically is, identified or stereotyped based on, a manifestation of their disability. And the opposite of that is a person's embarrassment who has experiencing a disability by not wanting to engage because they feel that they're being judged, or maybe that people won't like them. All of these social nuances make this a horrendously challenging issue. Right? Robin Williams said, I used to think that the worst thing in life was to end up alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel alone. Now, this quote really resonates for me in terms of thinking about caretakers or support people, DSPs, who intervene in people's lives in an effort to try to get people included, engaged, involved. And yet, it's just like moving a body around. It's their job, and in some cases that's sort of the personalization that goes with feeling good about yourself and feeling like you really are accepted and appreciated, can be ripped away by, a staff member just doing their job. And so now, let me rush to add when I say that there are obviously the need for caretaking and supporting and being available to help the person, navigate through life. But in some ways, I think we have to be sensitive to, our people that we support, that we touch, that we basically, care for. Do they feel like they're just commodities, just boxes being, put into the van and moved from point A to point B? And this begins to start to get us to think about the things we need to be sensitive to in addressing these, this challenge of loneliness that might be creeping into people's lives. So how do we address this, right? I think there are things to look at. We've looked at some of these things in this series, But this last bullet, being able to measure or try to get our hands around loneliness becomes, I think, a next challenge for us, the next hurrah. And this takes me to share with you things that are happening in other parts of the world that we can learn from, that we might be able to utilize. And the United Kingdom is really one of the countries that are leading the way in identifying loneliness as a specter and beginning to sort of say that as a society, it really requires all of us to think about it, to intervene. So in the UK, let me just share this with you that in 2018, a member of parliament by the name of Jo Cox, a female, a younger woman, was brutally murdered. And when the investigation on her death unfolded, what they discovered was this woman who seemingly had it all, was a member of parliament, was very attractive, was, seemingly always surrounded by people, essentially was so lonely that she was trying to dig her way out of her loneliness. She didn't want to admit she in private, diary stuff that was found, discovered that she was struggling with loneliness and never told anyone, right? So that was kind of like a wake-up call to government to say maybe this loneliness thing is a serious issue. And so in 2018, Parliament authorized the Jo Cox Commission. They named it in honor of her. And the commission was funded to examine the prevalence of loneliness in the UK. And they basically had, after the commission was concluded, they reported to Parliament their findings, and they had three major recommendations for Parliament. And one was that so much loneliness just goes unreported because there's such a stigma, and that needs to be reduced. We need to peel that onion back, and then making reducing loneliness a national agenda, and then improving the evidence. Right? These were the three major findings of the Jo Cox Commission, and so Parliament, took this very seriously, and they said, okay, let's. So they authorized a parliamentary level department. They founded another department of government to address loneliness, right? And that was authorized at the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019. There's an actual minister to lead the way in doing these three things, right, in the UK. And so there are some things that they've actually started to do, and you can see down below on this slide, actions to date, really beginning to try to make loneliness, less stigmatic, that literally almost like, if you have a physical ailment, you go see a doctor and they'll write a prescription. So what they decided to do in their public health initiative was to say, well, why can't we make a prescription? Why can't we do a prescription for addressing, the kinds of social things? And I'll share with you what some of those things are as we look at these scales. But really looking at the idea of a social hub where people can go, and this office for national statistics, and reimagining space. How does space influence loneliness? So thinking about now this measuring, right, which is one of the key elements that's happening in the UK and in other parts of the world. The University of California in Los Angeles kind of led the way. They developed their scale in 1968, and the scale basically has 20 items, and it uses a 4-point Likert scale. So in research parlance, that means it's a graded sort of system from lowest to highest. And there's points awarded for the questions. And then there's a range of score that can unfold. 80 points is the highest score that can be rendered on a UCLA scale. 20 is the lowest because each question has a point ascribed to it. And there are lessons from the themes that I think we can begin to identify it. So here's the UCLA Loneliness Scale, and this is the one that Tanya had sent out to you. And you could see it goes from never to often, right? So you got the four domains, and a point for each one. Now, one of the things that they did with the UCLA scale, because oftentimes when people are given, scales in social science research, they try to figure out what are they looking for and how might I be able to score. So if all these questions would be answered never, right, that would that the person taking the scale might try to figure it out and answer the way that would make them feel or be perceived as less lonely. So they have reverse scored items on this scale, and you can see at the very bottom on this slide, I've indicated which items are reverse scored, right? So item 1, all the 5, 6, 9, 10, 15, 16, 19, 20 are all reverse scored. So, for example, look at number 20. There are people I can turn to. If you say there are never anyone I can turn to, that would actually be scored 4 points, right? Because it's reverse scored. A 1 is a 4, and a score of 4 is a 1 in terms of points ascribed, right? Answering 2 would be 3, answering 3 would be 2. So it's just reverse scored. So when you do the scale and you answer the questions as they appear, and then before you tally up your score, you reverse score it. The total amount, the higher the score, the lonelier you are, the lower the score, the less lonely you are, right? So, we had asked folks to do this in advance of this session today. And I was wondering if folks might be able to, you don't have to identify yourself, but if you did do the test and you rendered a score based on that scoring key at the bottom, can you go into the chat room right now and give us your score? Right? You don't disclose who you are, but just if you took the survey, if you could put your score in the chat room, just the numerical score of what yours was, I think it would be interesting to sort of see how that is. Again, we don't want to identify anyone who might be there. So let's go into this chat room and take a look and see here. So we have a score of 20, someone 46, okay? 24, 26. Now, as the scores are coming out, just to share with you that when the Cigna study in the United States did this, they identified the cutoff at 43, right? 43. And so if the score is above 43, then that's really signaling some concerns about loneliness. If it's less, then that's more consistent. On that slide I showed you a minute ago that said that there was a 20% increase in loneliness. That's mostly how these scores are beginning to trend up over time. And now the interesting thing is, if you would take this scale and do it with, someone you support, or someone, that is experiencing a disability, and really begin, or with a family, sitting down with a family that you support, and really beginning to get your hands around some of these things, it begins to give us, at least it begins to put a face on this idea of loneliness. Now, there's also another value to a scale like this over and above the score that's rendered. I mean, you can use it with a score. For example, you can sit with somebody, do the scale, discover that, maybe they scored 46. And then you really try to do some interventions, or try to create some supports that would address loneliness, and then re-measure after the treatment or after the intervention, and see if in fact are there any variances in the scores after you did something different for the person or for the family. Okay? Now, if you look at the questions on this scale, you see there are some clues here about intervention approaches that we might take. For example, number 8, look at number 8. My interest and ideas are not shared by those around me. Right? So now, on that kind of question really begins to say, well, if someone was in a venue where people were doing or talking or participating in something they liked, would that be effective? So the notion of then supporting people to go to places where other people do what they like, right, begins to address that number 8, right? That question number 8. I feel left out, number 11, right? I feel left out. Begin to say, okay, what does that mean if somebody scores a high on I feel left out often? They say I feel left out. Then maybe an intervention can be tailored. You can say, well, let's see if we can get this person positioned in a setting or in a venue where they won't feel left out, right? Maybe they feel left out because they can't perform something. So maybe if there can be some assistance, or maybe even some capacity building in some performance that would impact that, right? All these questions, people are around me but not with me, right? That's number 18, right? People are around me but not with me. That really speaks to loneliness in the midst of other people. There are people I can turn to. There are people I can talk to, right? These again begin to sort of say, if we do interventions, or if we can consider interventions that might focus a bit more on some of those topical issues, we might get a little bit closer. So that's the UCLA scale. Right? Now, again, reserve your questions for our Q&A, because I want to counter compare this with let me get to this, the Young Gearfeld scale, which has been out there now for 15 years. And it basically, the thing about this scale that people tend to like is that it can be abbreviated, right? And the abbreviation of the scale can just take, if you don't have a lot of time to go through 11 items or through 20 items on the UCLA scale, you can just do these 3 fundamental items and really get a focused picture. So let me show you this scale. Right? Now you could see there are 5 points total that can be addressed, right? None of the time, rarely, some of the time, often, all of the time on the questions. And again, if you look at these questions and you take this scale, and I think we sent these scales out to you, so you should have access to them, you can kind of look and see the comparability of this kind of scale with the UCLA scale, for example. And again, there are some, the ones that I, on this slide, the ones that I put the little asterisk by are the 6 more fundamental, out of the 11. These are the 6 ones that are weighed a little bit heavier. Right? I miss having people around me, number 9. I often feel rejected, number 10. 7, there are many people I can trust completely. This issue of trust comes up in all of these scales, and it's a powerful piece of the measuring loneliness agenda, right? Because if someone can't trust or doesn't feel like they can trust, there's that element alone really makes things more challenging. So now there's one more scale to look at here, or 2 more scales. This is the social connectedness scale. This was developed in 1985. And there are 8 items. This one really was designed more for younger users, in school, in an effort to really get a sense of how connected are teens and kids in school. And so if you look at this scale, it has 6 variants. So 1 means I strongly agree, 6, I strongly disagree, and then the gradations in between those poles, right? And again, if you look at the questions, you see some similarity to some of the ones on the DeYoung scale and on the UCLA scale. I feel disconnected. Even people I know don't feel I really belong. Even around people I know, I don't feel like I belong. I feel so distant from people. I have no sense of togetherness with my peers. I catch myself losing all sense of connectedness. I don't feel that I participate with anyone or any group. And so this scale has been, this social connectedness scale, again, has been used a lot in forward-thinking schools that are really trying to address this notion of social connection for the kids in the school, and how important that is to learning. How important it is when someone feels like they're aligned, they feel more valued in that venue.
Al, there's a question in the chat.
Sure.
It says, how do I explain emptiness to someone with a developmental disability?
Yeah. Well, that's the sticker on all of these scales, is that there are nuances and there are abstractions that really need to be concretized or made more foundational, right? These scales were not developed for someone with a cognitive or an intellectual issue, right? They were designed and developed for typical cognition and typical intellectual functioning. So someone who's atypical for whatever reason on that scale, we need to sort out ways of concretizing some of these questions so that a person that has an intellectual disability can understand the nature of the question, right? So now again, this goes to show you that in our field, there has really been no sensitivity to loneliness and disability. It's almost like the sense if somebody has an intellectual disability, they won't be lonely. They can't be lonely. And so, no social scientists have really even ventured to try to create a scale that is digestible to someone with a intellectual disability. And so that alone underscores the void and the devaluation of folks with disabilities, is because no social scientists think, well, it's not even important enough to figure that out. That's been my rub with this whole area of social connectedness and social capital, has been that in our field there hasn't really been much. And the energy of our field has been, well, let's fix the disability, or let's try to compensate. Let's try to address dysfunction in a micro way, rather than think about these more powerful, I believe, social implications that come up in these kind of scales. My challenge back to you is to really think about how can we describe emptiness? How would we frame that so that someone could understand it, that happens to have an intellectual disability, and that or is that too abstract of a phenomena to for someone with an intellectual disability to understand? And no, I think that the onus is on us, the challenge is on us, in order to create an understanding of some of these issues so that someone can, or just if it's not digestible, just extract it from the list and just go with other dimensions that are more understandable and easier to concretize. But I think that's a great point that's being raised, that there are hard to measure pieces of all these scales, especially with an audience that might have an intellectual issue that would get in the way of interpreting what the question actually means. So moving on, here's one more scale, and this, I only put this up just so you can compare and contrast some of the items to be measured. Right? And if you look at this one, this one is a little bit more digestible, right? These questions 1 through 15, it's a little more concretized And that's why, I wanted to share it with you. I feel badly because I'm isolated from others. I feel unhappy because I'm left out. I feel sad because I don't have companionship or people in my life. I have a sense of emptiness because I lack friends. That's a little abstract. I feel dejected. It's abstract. It hurts to be so alone. And so this really trying to get more into the feeling tone of loneliness. And so there are some key lessons here. And let me just kind of summarize this as we open this up now for some questions, as I get ready to kind of conclude the prepared remarks and then really get into a dialogue about this. There are some key lessons that I think come from looking at these kinds of scales, right? One is logistical opportunities. That is, can people get to places where they can feel appreciated and they can feel like they're a part of the mix? What are appropriate supports with DSPs and with any caretaker who is supporting someone? How are those supports appropriately rendered so that the support person isn't in the limelight and that the person who's being supported stays in the limelight? And then this idea of using similarities to connect so that people feel that they are relevant, that their interests are relevant with everyone else. Building trust and what that means and that whole process. And that's a challenging issue for any of us. Building the self-confidence to engage and to get into the mix. And then the whole phenomena of growing the relationship. A lot of the conversations I know I've had with many of you that are on this call have been, okay, how do we get somebody into the mix initially, right? And those of you guys who know some of my work know that, well, you do a cultural profile, find out what somebody likes, you map the community and find out where is there an existing venue. You then look at that venue and you analyze the social infrastructure, what's expected there. And then you look for the gatekeeper to really help in the transition with the person's inclusion, their penetration into that community, right? That those 4 steps are ones that I've been talking about for the last 25 years. But the growing of relationships is now where we need to drill down. We can get somebody in the mix. We can find, a place where other people gather who like what that person likes. You can analyze and look at the infrastructure and say, okay, what do you have to do? What are the rituals here? What's expected of me? And you can find a gatekeeper. But then once the relationships start to develop, how can we grow them, right? How can that relationship grow from bridging to bonding, right? Which is the more powerful element that addresses loneliness, right? Again, you can be in the party and not of the party, right? And so how do we get people to have those relationships grow that are more bonded, right? So those are some of the lessons when we take the variables of loneliness and we explore them. So let me just summarize this, and then we can get into a Q&A. Margaret Wheatley, wonderful purveyor of community, in a book called Conversations Can Change the World, says that human conversation is the most ancient and easiest way to cultivate the conditions for change, whether those changes are personal, community, organizational, or even planetary changes. We're seeing now with the climate, summit that was held in Glasgow. Literally, how do we change the planet, right? If we can sit together and talk about what's important to us, we begin to come alive. And so those kinds of notions of getting people into the mix where they can engage becomes the most fundamental, I think, lesson of all of this. Because it's not our differences that divide us, it's the judgments that people have about those differences that divide us. And that this notion of connectedness is, multifaceted, and that, your connection to one person can be a stepstone to a connection to another person. And each person you're connected to can be a gatekeeper to communities. So if you belong to no community, we know that your risks of, bad things happening go up. And even the risk of dying can be cut in half by connectedness with other people. This is from Robert Putnam, right out of his book, Bowling Alone. So here we are. There must be a beginning to any great matter, but continuing to the end until it be thoroughly finished yields the true glory. All of us on this call have been on this journey, right? We've been on this voyage of getting people engaged in community, right? Getting people connected. And that if we don't really think about the depth of this notion of loneliness, then we're just scratching the surface, right? We're not digging into what really matters. And so let me finish with this Aztec story. Some of you guys have heard me talk about this. I find this, by the way, this comes right out of Margaret Wheatley's book, Conversations Can Change the World. It's called An Aztec Story, and it goes like this. A long time ago, there was a great fire in the forest that covered our earth. People and animals started to run, trying to escape from the fire. Our brother Al Tocatl was running away also when he noticed a small bird hurrying back and forth between the fire and the river. And he headed toward this small bird. He noticed that it was the quetzal bird, running to the river, picking up small drops of water in his beak, returning to the fire, throwing that little bit of water on the flame. And so the owl approached the quetzal bird and he said, "What are you doing, brother? Are you crazy? That little drop of water is not going to put the fire out. You gotta get out of here. You gotta run, run for your life. You're not going to change this." The quetzal bird stopped for a moment. He looked at the owl and he answered, "I'm doing the best I can with what I have to save a place that I love." It is remembered by our grandparents that a long time ago in the forest that covered our earth, the earth was saved from a great fire by a small little quetzal bird and an owl and many other animals and people who got together to put out the flame. Okay? It's a beautiful little parable of synergy and of social modeling and of how your behavior affects my behavior. And that when we begin to think about people who are left behind, who feel lonely, who don't feel like they're part of the mix, that they don't have the companionship, that they feel empty, that, what can we do about that? We're not going to change every lonely person's situation, but, as we think about our own behavior in the midst of those kinds of situations, and if each of us become a little bit more sensitive to that, then, amazing things can happen. It's like a sea rise. All the boats can go up. And so, we must become the change we hope to create. If there's loneliness in the world, it's really up to us to try to do whatever we can to address that, right? And again, these are deep, embedded social challenges. So, but if each of us do our little part, maybe we can begin to rise those boats. So contact info for me, Tanya always mentions this, and I always want you to know that if you have any questions or we need to dig a little bit deeper, here's how to get in touch with me. If you feel that might be helpful in your quest or in your organization's quest. And now what I'd like to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, go back to our matrix, and then begin the Q&A on this really powerful notion of addressing and measuring loneliness in an effort to get our hands around it. So let me do this, stop sharing this screen, back into the matrix, and here we are, okay. And I think we have a 75, 80 people aboard. So obviously getting specific questions, we won't be able to get to all the questions that people might have, but let's see if we could raise some things that might be of use to all of us as we think about it. And this challenge is new, and people are just beginning to awaken to this generically in our society. So all the answers are certainly not out there, but I think raising our sensitivity to it and really beginning to think about it is the first step toward a solution to a challenge. So Corey was going to try to monitor the chat room. Are there any questions or even comments or reflections that you might have? I again know that unless you can get your hands around something, it's hard to really change it. So, and that's why people have avoided this issue of loneliness generically in our society. So I think the efforts of trying to get our hands around it is a step in the right direction. So let's
okay, open it. There are a few.
Great.
The comment, this is a follow-up comment. If the person cannot communicate, baseline assumption would be that likely the person is potentially lonely, and we would support them to get connected to potentially help with this.
Yeah. I think that, I've done this kind of talks before, right? And somebody came up to me at a talk that I did just recently. Actually, this was in Indianapolis. I was at a conference, and I did a workshop. This was for a rehab association, right? And so there were, a couple hundred people at this gathering, and a person came up to me and said to me, this was a good talk. Thanks for, sensitizing us to, this serious issue of loneliness. She said, but are we creating a problem? She said, my guys are happy. She said, are we kind of telling them that they're lonely? Are we literally sort of these guys have pretty simple lives, and they're smile all the time, and nothing seems to faze them, and wow, I didn't know where to go with that. The first thing was they're not her guys. That was the first thing. And then the notion that somehow, some way, a phenomena like loneliness would evade somebody with an intellectual disability because it's too abstract to apply to them. I have troubles with that as well. I just think that, and so I don't know, and I told her, and this was a little sidebar conversation, thank God, because had she raised this, in front of all the other people, it would have really been, it's a vexing issue of devaluation, because I think if you say that somebody who has an intellectual disability is not capable of feeling loneliness, I would have to reject that because I think that's a human dimension, and we're human beings, and intellectual functioning doesn't, it doesn't get factored in there. She thought it should get factored in there. I don't know. What do you think about, a question like that, or somebody's reaction like that, as if my cousin Carrie, who had Down syndrome and an intellectual disability, was not capable of feeling lonely. There was times she was lonely, and I knew that, and we all knew that. And so it's not as if, I think it's our inability to really understand the human dimension here of this issue of loneliness. This is a human dimension. It's not a stratification that only people of certain intellectual ilk could experience. And so I don't know. Your thoughts, any of your thoughts on that? So
yeah, I think
question.
I was going to say, I think that's something I've come across a lot with families in the past, that like older families, because I think that's how they were taught to think about disabilities, that they don't feel the same way we feel. And it's been proven time and time again that that's not true. But I think what I run into mostly with a lot of the consumers I support in my program, they don't recognize that, like they can't name loneliness. They don't really understand that even though they have staff that pop in throughout the day and stuff, that they're not really developing those connections necessarily. And so just developing those relationships with people with any people with or without developmental disabilities is so important to stave off that loneliness and just build true connection with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, amen. I think that our discussion today is on loneliness, but I think folks with intellectual disabilities have been plagued with this dichotomy in so many other issues, not just loneliness, but it's devaluing, and it's insulting, So I think part of that reckoning, that reckoning, if you will, becomes, I've been, when I first started to really think about this whole measuring of loneliness and think about that in a broader way, it made me think about taking that UCLA scale and making the questions understandable to all of us. It's almost like, if you put in a ramp, everybody can get in, whether you're walking up or whether you're wheeling up. The ramp sort of universally, flattens the field for everybody. And so, part of my thinking was, can we take that scale and really make each of those questions understood by everyone? Because I mean, even the question of emptiness that was raised earlier, I mean, that's hard for me to even, emptiness. What the hell does that mean? I'm not, I'm not sure I even understand that, right? And so, can we make it understandable to everybody? And not simplifying it or making it childlike, but making it just understandable, for all of us. And we tried to do that with the social capital benchmarking survey. I think some of you guys know, and I've talked to many of you that are on this call about measuring social capital, right? And we took the scale developed by Robert Putnam at Harvard that looks at measuring someone's engagement in community, where they go, who do they go with, how often do they go. And Putnam developed that instrument basically to try to baseline engagement for society, just for everyone. What is typical in terms of engagement. And so we took it, and some of the more abstract questions, we just sort of rephrased them. And then we used that social capital benchmarking scale on folks with all types of disabilities. We did this in a study in 2016 that appeared in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. And the article appeared in the Canadian Journal. I think you can take a scale like the UCLA scale and make it more interpretable for everyone. That's just part of inclusion. That's what inclusion is, creating an environment that everybody is welcomed, that it's not, bifurcated. Well, this is a loneliness test for you, and we'll have a loneliness test for, someone with an intellectual, that separate is never equal, and so creating something that everyone can engage with, I think makes sense. That's macro change, right? That's changing, the culture and the way the culture measures loneliness, as opposed to saying, well, let's fix the disability so that they understand, the questions. I don't know. So other questions, other thoughts?
So the next one, I'm piloting quality of life surveys that include social isolation and loneliness questions in my respite program. I find it challenging to get caregivers to complete the survey. Do you have any suggestions to encourage people to complete the survey so we can measure this?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question, because there's reasons why some people won't do scales or answer surveys. And some of it is that they don't have the time. Some of it is that they just don't understand the question. Some of it is that they don't want to be singled out as having a problem. So that I think the best way, in my own experience in this as a researcher, has really been to actually, you can incentivize in some ways the completion of a survey. We did a survey, for example, in Pittsburgh and in Australia, in Brisbane and in Pittsburgh, and we surveyed 50 families in Pittsburgh and 50 families in Brisbane. 25 of those families in both cohorts were families who had children with disabilities. The other 25 were families who had children that did not have a disability label, right? But they were similar in age and gender to the families who had children with disability labels, right? And so we, in order to get people to actually participate, we incentivized it, and families would receive a $25 gift card to the grocery store in Pittsburgh. The Giant Eagle was a big grocery chain in our city, and so sometimes that incentives will get people to participate. That it's almost like you think about here. I think I mentioned you. I'm in Las Vegas as we talk, and yesterday we were looking for a place to eat. We're in one of the hotels, and so we went online, to investigate a couple different restaurants. And so my wife says, "Well, look at the reviews. Let's look at the reviews to determine if the restaurant is good," because we had never been to the restaurant. So you looked at the reviews, and there was 5 or 6 5-star responses, and there were like 3 or 4 1-star responses, right? And so what gets people riled up so that they actually review a restaurant. Think about your own pattern of behavior. You know, if you had a great time, you're probably going to maybe put a review on, you know, on Open Table or on one of the platforms. And if you had a shitty experience, and you're probably going to also, you know, weigh in. But, you know, most of the other people kind of in the middle are probably not going to do the review. Either it just doesn't take enough time, or they just don't feel it's worth it, or, you know, whatever the case might be. So when you're looking at surveying people on anything, you know, and how do you get people to weigh in on how they feel about whatever you're looking to measure? And so in this case, the measurement of loneliness, or on the case of measuring engagement, the social capital benchmarking form, or getting people to measure an experience on an airplane, or with a restaurant. So I think, you know, there can be incentives that might get people to participate. Again, sometimes if you do that, people will just do it only for the incentive. They figure, what the hell, I'm going to get that $25 gift card. I'm just going to say whatever I want to say, and then I'll get the gift card. Social science research is imprecise, and there's always the possibilities of noise, or, you know, just things that get in the way of what you're really trying to measure. And that's why sometimes, you know, people don't really, they don't try to measure social issues, because they figure it's just a little too corrupt in terms of, you know, people who answer, people who don't answer, and why people answer. That doesn't give you a true picture. But I see it just simply as a snapshot in time, right? And it tells you something about the here and now of what you're looking to measure. And you learn something from it. You know, you can extract something from what you learn, and then try to adjust or try to change something that would make whatever your product is, or whatever your intentionality is, better.
Thanks, Al. So the next one's a quick question. Who was the author of the book you mentioned, Conversations Can Change the World?
Oh, great questions. That's Margaret Wheatley, Wheatley. Margaret Wheatley, just a phenomenal author. Her big book is called The Aquarian Conspiracy. It was written probably 30 years ago. Yeah, she's just really a thoughtful social, you know, purveyor. She kind of really has some cool stuff. She did a book that looked at how the world mostly functions by examining linear things, right? And yet that when you think linearly, you think, you know, if I do A, then B will happen, and then once B happens, then C will happen, and then once C occurs, then D will unfold. That's a linear kind of an interpretation. And what Wheatley actually did was say, wait, the world doesn't operate in a linear format. The world operates in a quantum kind of a way, that events can be, you know, they can be just unanticipated, and yet have an incredible impact on an issue that wasn't imagined in a linear kind of a format. And so, but the book Conversations Can Change the World is just a great expose on the simplicity of connection and the impact of connection. So take a look at it, Margaret Wheatley.
Great, thanks, Al. So this next one comes from Monique. I have this conversation about connections all the time with someone I support, and how this is where we find people who are like-minded and will be there, and who we can feel are part of our larger picture. I always feel like I was trying to get this person more engaged in the world around them, and this seems to be sticking with the person. And they've made a connection through a connection, and so on and so forth, like a chain. I'm glad there's a science behind it, as I felt like I was kind of making it up. Thanks for adding validation to my way or process and thinking. And I wanted to thank you, as today I had a family type emergency with a young adult who's struggling. And this is the information I needed to reaffirm how I can help this young person who's struggling with a specific topic and a few others.
Great, great. Well, thank you. That's because there are these linkages in this, and I think in our field we've been so micro focused. I said this earlier in the presentation, that we end up measuring how we change a person that we're supporting, how we might bring out the best in them, how we might get them to be able to do something a little bit better or do something a little bit more easily. And that, that's just the nature of our field. It is micro dominated. And I think these conversations that we've been having through the series that Community Living Algoma has put together has really been an examination of the macro, right? Of the community, of the culture, of that, putting us all together and saying, okay, what is our role in all of this? And measuring loneliness is obviously a micro sort of thing. I sit with you, you fill out the survey, we interpret the survey, and then we begin to say, okay, what can you do differently, right? But I think our conversation today is really to say, what are the lessons we can learn from these ways of measuring loneliness, with our topic for today? What are the lessons we can learn that would apply to all of us in our impact in community? And this is not what can we do to make my cousin Carrie build relationships so she doesn't become lonely, or she sheds some of her loneliness. We want to see that happen, of course, but how that's not only going to happen when the world changes, when things around Carrie change. Carrie can change a little bit too. Micro and macro should be hand in glove, but nonetheless, I think in our field, we've been so influenced to think that this is just a macro or micro agenda, that is just about the person and not about the culture or the community. And so I think that these sessions that we've been having has really been to try to just raise consciousness that Carrie is going to be less lonely when people in the community embrace her, right? Not when she, I don't know, does some magic trick, that we teach her, but when people in the community reach out and welcome her, right? And so that means they change to do that, as opposed to Carrie changing to fit in to what they expect, right? And there's work to be done in so many different fronts on that macro challenge. It's almost like, where do you begin? There's so many things to do, and that's, I think, some of the reason why people throw up their hands and say, "No, what the hell? We're not going to change the world." That's we're and much like we discussed in our session on change, we are creatures of habit. We like to do what we can predict is going to happen, and so we stay in our status quo and don't venture out of our comfort zone into another place. So loneliness is a two-way street. It's not just the person doesn't want to participate or just feels like they're not appreciated. It's also the person who makes the individual feel that way, and so in our field, we have these people we support who like the captive audience, and changing other people just in the general community just seems like it's outside of our possible realm. And I don't think it is. I mean, I think that there are macro things that can be done. I did a session, I think, in part of this series, where we went over 6 little projects that could be done to try to make the world a little bit better, I'm working on a book. If I continue to keep my nose at the grindstone, where I want to write up these 10 ideas for macro change. Just, they have nothing to do with disability. They're not disability strategies. They're how do we make the world just a better place? What are some of the things we could do? If you bring some of those things up to your board of directors or to your boss, they'll probably say, what the hell does that have to do with disability? What does putting a little free library, little birdhouse library have to do with people with disabilities? Why would we do something like that? Why would we spend our resources and our time in doing something like that? And that's, that I understand the nature of that question, but that pushes us back to micro, right? It doesn't really say, do we have an obligation to try to make our community a better place? And not just make it a better place because we take care of people with disabilities, but what are we doing to make our community, just more resilient and more willing to be inclusive, right? And that's a harder, that's really a harder issue for people, for boards of directors, for leadership teams to get their hands around. And so it's much easier just to divert back and say, okay, let's take care of our clients. Let's just take care of, we'll just make sure they're okay, they're happy, and that they're,
Okay, Al, there's quite a few more questions.
Yeah,
to
good.
get through.
Good.
So Keenan, I think you unmuted, so I don't know if you want me to read your comment or if you wanted to go ahead and ask.
I've been listening for so long, I probably changed my comment now. But, listen, I was just thinking of, kind of the brutality of when a staff member's decided, like, the people they're supporting really, they don't have feelings or can't experience these things or wouldn't understand it. We have to really work hard on shifting that. But I think that's just evidence that staff members also become institutionalized, almost like a prison mentality with the guards and the prisoners, and they just can't get out of that thinking. But speaking of that, I think to a experience when Julie and I were visiting another agency, and we walked into a sheltered workshop, and everyone kind of dropped what they're doing and rushed the door like we were Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift. And but they didn't know us from Adam. And the staff member's like, oh yeah, it's a very friendly group. And I'm thinking, no, it's a desperate group. Yeah. They don't care who we are. They want to be doing anything other than what they're stuck in right now. And like that, you're not seeing that clue. Yeah. This is not deliberate on your part, that you're isolating, like you're just not seeing it. And so, I think that's, so, okay, if they can't understand some of the language of a survey and stuff, but there's other ways we can look for the clues. So what lights them up, as opposed to how, if they can't express, what bores them to tears, or what they, how much they hate, doing karaoke when they don't even like singing every day. Like maybe they can't express it on a survey, but you can see the clues, like what attracts them, what excites them. And things like that, the obvious signs they want to escape something. But I see this all the time with the confusion of, well, we take them to Tim's because then they have people to talk to and this sort of thing. I'm like, and it's like, well, some of them don't even like Tim's. They don't want to, they're more excited to talk to someone sitting over there, but they can't because they're in this group and they're already stigmatized, and it's just like a fail on so many levels. But I just think, it just starts with, I think it was Monique that put it, it just starts with the kind of that curiosity over getting to know people and what interests them. And then you just go, see what lights them up. And like, it's like the same indicator, like that's showing this thing is making them bored and lonely, whether they can express it or not. And this thing is making them excited and happy. So like this whole like, oh, it's too complicated, they'll never understand it. Well, we always figure out what foods they like. There's lots of clues. So just attack it in the same way. If you're really interested, you can definitely do it.
Yeah. Great point, Keenan.
I'll keep reading through, Al. There's
Yeah.
quite a few comments that kind of go to the same same topic. So I'll read through a couple. So Selena says she supports a person and 100% believes that they can recognize that they're lonely, they're missing family that they once had in their lives and are no longer around. They must feel some sort of loneliness. And then Wendy goes on to say that I understand the meaning of you don't have to be alone to be lonely. I also think parents, family, and friends are coming from a good place when trying to keep people so busy. But again, just being busy is not filling the void of loneliness. Conversations are so very important to be had so that people actually get what they're needed from a relationship. And it's not just a body or a place filling time. We all need connections to feel whole.
Yeah.
And then
Keep going. Yeah, these are good.
So
These are really
Monique
good
says she
questions.
finds it interesting that people in general want to dismiss the feelings of people with disabilities. Like they almost think they don't have feelings or they don't want to take time to talk about it. Why would people think they can't feel lonely? Do they think they don't feel love? They don't feel scared, angry? It's frustrating as I often feel like their feelings or the nature of them are often dismissed. Like, oh, that's just how that person is. Meanwhile, if I've learned anything and I'm new to the field, there's a reason for each behavior. I don't know a better word at the moment to express what I'm trying to say or reaction. That with a little patience, a little practice, we may just get to what or how a person's feeling or experiencing. I also think depending on your generation, feelings are also not talked about.
Yeah, these are really, really great reactions and responses. And that in our field, we're looking for solutions. We're looking for, well, tell me what I could do to reduce loneliness. Show me, give me, the pill that's going to address this. And I obviously we don't know that, but what we do know is that all of us have our own lens and have experienced loneliness. All right, all of us have, and all of us are working in and through our lives to try to combat loneliness and to be engaged and stay engaged. And what are we doing, and why would it not be relevant for what we might be able to do for Carrie, or the way we might support Carrie in terms of the way we would want to be supported, to address loneliness. So there is no, on these issues, there is no, again, this gets back to Margaret Wheatley. There's no linear, formula. You do A, then do B, and then do C, and voila, you get D. That these are, complex quantum related phenomena that we just have to persist. Now, there are things I think we can do to create a better, more welcoming culture. Some of you guys know, and in fact, in some of the Perry Sound and some of the other settings, we've done world cafes, right? That were designed to try to bring people together, not people, from disability world, but people from community, into a conversation about inclusivity, not disability inclusivity, but just human inclusivity, and having doing things like that. Now, obviously, you don't get to everybody, and only, you know, people who come to those kinds of things are already enlightened, you would think. But nonetheless, I think those kinds of, I remember we were doing the World Cafe in Perry Sound, and we were at the Opera House, right? And it was really just a great community venue, and you know, we had some food, we invited people in, they were kind of grazing, we had some music playing. It was really very cool kind of community event. And I remember, you know, I met this woman. I was at one of the grazing stations just getting something to eat, and there was a woman. I introduced myself, and I said, you know what, and I said, well, you know, like, why did you come? And she said, well, I'm new, I just moved here. And she said, and I saw the flyer on this thing, and I just thought it was just, you know, I thought it was just, I want to be welcomed, you know, I want to be included. And so I thought, you know, yeah, this is for me. She sort of like saw herself as the person who would benefit from this World Cafe. And you know, so that kind of stuff, I think we need to think about, how do we do more community building? How do, you know, that is not about, well, that's, you know, doing a speech about disability to the Kiwanis or the Elks, but community building in a more generic way that's about, you know, just welcoming, just creating a welcoming environment. And I don't know if we've been so polarized as disability agencies that we don't have the capacity to do something like that, or maybe we think that's somebody else's responsibility. But I think there are things like that we ought to keep considering doing in just strengthening the fabric of our communities. Not necessarily making them just loving to people with disabilities, but just making them more welcoming to anybody, to everybody. And you know, some folks might argue, well, that isn't our agenda, you know, that we are, you know, we're supposed to be helping people with disabilities. That's what's in our, you know, that's what's in our mission statement, and that's okay. You know, that's okay if the agency feels like that. How might it find somebody else then to do this broader community building? Because without a welcoming community, all the stuff we're doing isn't worth a hill of beans. I mean, it really isn't, unless the community is welcoming, right? And so if people have been excluded, it's because the community isn't as welcoming as it could be, right? So it just seems that these kinds of macro things ought to be in our conversations. Maybe we don't do them all the time, or maybe we don't do them at all. Maybe we try to encourage somebody else to do them, but that they get done, that somehow, some way they get done in our communities. And so enough ranting about that. We got about 5 more minutes. Anything else, Corey, that's come in?
Yeah, there's a few more. I'm gonna read Julie's comment just because it ties in with what you were saying. There's not a formula or recipe, but we can be more intentional with how we support people in the community.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to go back up. So Erica says, I've been reflecting on the science and how social pain registers in the exact part of the brain as physical pain. The body and brain register social pain as physical pain. You can take a Tylenol and feel some relief from that social pain. Not that I'm recommending dependency on painkillers, but it's fascinating. And I think about how this directly relates to the health impact of loneliness. And there is a couple more I want to get to. So if you want to comment quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Marie's asking, how would you support someone who is an extreme introvert understand the importance of connections with others?
Yeah. Well, you know, the introversion extroversion question is always, it always comes out there, especially in terms of loneliness. Is somebody's naturally shy? How do they make friends? If somebody is, you know, introverted, you know, they don't of somebody maybe on the spectrum who just doesn't want to be in groups of people and doesn't want to be around big groups of people, still doesn't mean that folks don't need or crave, companionship, connectability, and it may be not as much, but they still crave it. I mean, whether you're shy, introverted, on the spectrum, whatever the rationale is for someone not wanting to be a backslapper and to be in a big party, that's okay. It's just, but there needs to be access to other people, no matter what. And I think the biggest impact with somebody who's shy or introverted, or maybe someone who's just socially uncomfortable, is how should other people treat them, right? If there's an obligation, I believe, to the extroverts of the world to be more welcoming to everybody. And so if you're at a I don't know, some kind of a gathering, and you're talking with some other people, and you have this little conversation going on, and somebody walks in by themselves, you recognize them, and they're by themselves, seeming clearly, looking for some connectability. Call them over, just like, well, come on over. Hey, there's Tanya. Tanya, come on over and join us. I mean, just what the hell does that doesn't take a whole lot of. It just takes some consciousness and some sense of others. And what is it like if you're on the other side of that equation? You walk into a place, you're by yourself, you don't know anybody. Wouldn't you want somebody to welcome you? So it's getting to those people to become more, welcoming. And I don't know. It's not like I'm trying to, say everybody has to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and I mean, it's not a bad idea to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but be that as it may, I think the obligations are both macro and micro, and the obligations to a better community are both macro and micro, and so I think just raising the consciousness and sensitivity to that. Maybe thinking about how do we do that? What are some of the ways we do that? So in any event, I think we're rounding the corner. I know everybody has obligations. I'm going to get down and start gambling in the casino. I'm in New York. New York is where we're staying, and but I know everyone on the call has other really important things they've got to get to. But I got to tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to spend an hour or two on a topic that is, it's not fun to think about, loneliness, but it is a part of the way, the world. And we as members of community, we as fellow brothers and sisters have like an obligation to each other to try to see if there's anything we might be able to do about it. Whatever lessons might be there for your agency, great. Whatever lessons might be there personally, that's great too. But I think we need to talk about these things. So I appreciate you taking the time from your schedules with all the other things, all the other demands you have on your time. And mostly, I really want to thank Tanya, John Policiccio, the good folks at Community Living Algoma. Corey, thank you for navigating through all those questions for us, for hosting our session today. So Tanya, any final parting thoughts? I know we have one more session that we have planned.
Yeah, just thank you for everyone for attending, and Al for your wonderful presentation. And I know there's a few emails and things I got around the sessions and the recordings and things like that. So I will make sure I send that out. and reminding everyone that our last session is measuring social capital, which is on Tuesday, December 14th, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'll send out that link and information.
Yeah, when you get the link and information on that session, by the way, you're also going to get the social capital benchmarking survey. And when you get that, I much like we tried to do today in terms of getting you personally into the weeds of loneliness today by getting that scale ahead of time and thinking about it, maybe taking it. We want to do the same thing for next session. When you get the scale, it'll take you about 15 minutes to answer the questions. There's about 40 questions that look at your own engagement patterns. And again, we'll examine that a little bit more closely next session. And really, hopefully, you'll be able to take that tool and use it with some of the folks that you support in an effort to get better benchmark on how engaged are the men and women that you're currently supporting, and where are the opportunities for engagement that'll come out of that survey. Okay, great. So Tanya, thanks so much, guys. Have a wonderful day. Be safe. Wash your hands. I got my mask. Look at my mask. This is my doo-wop doctor's mask. I got to wear it down in the casino, but it's hopefully gonna get me some money today. So thank you guys. Have a great
Have fun in Vegas. Stay safe.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to
Bye,
see
everyone.
you guys.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye. Have a great day, everyone.
There we go. That's it. There's just the two of us left. I put everybody else in the waiting room.
Oh, okay, because I was gonna say I saw some people, but okay.
Yeah, joined is just us. Everybody else is in the waiting room. I think people either walk away from their computers and they don't, you know what I mean? They must just be listening to it, but they don't sign off.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll sign off when we close it.
Okay.
I grabbed all the chat room, copy and pasted it for you, and it's in a Word
Awesome.
document. I'll send it over to you in like 2 seconds.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. And then when the recording's done, I'll send it to Lucas.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so
Takes
much.
almost all day to convert. So,
Okay, thank you.
okay. We'll see you in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Bye.
Bye.